When I walked into the divorce courtroom that morning, the air felt colder than winter steel, and every eye seemed to follow me as though they already knew how the day would end. Evan stood by the plaintiff's table, hands in his pockets, hair perfectly styled as if this were some kind of celebration rather than the dismantling of our life. He didn't even wait for me to reach my seat before leaning in close, his breath warm against my ear. "Don't cry now," he whispered, smooth and cruel. "You'll need those tears when I take the house." Clara, standing just behind him in a cream coat far too expensive for her supposed consultant salary, let out a soft laugh. "And the car," she added, as if she were discussing a weekend sale, not my future. Then Lorraine, his mother, the queen of quiet venom, lifted her chin and smiled. "And your pride," she said, "though that seems to be fading already." Their attorney arranged his stack of binders with theatrical confidence, papers snapping crisply, a sound meant to remind me how prepared they were and how defeated they thought I was. I placed my own envelope, a plain, unimpressive manila folder, on the table. Evan snorted. Clara smirked. Lorraine openly laughed. To them, it looked like nothing. The judge entered, stern and efficient, and the courtroom rose. When we were seated again, she reached for the first document at hand, my envelope. I watched her expression shift ever so slightly as she flipped through the pages. Silence thickened. Then, unexpectedly, she let out a sharp, startled laugh that echoed off the paneled walls. Evan shot upright. "What's funny?" he blurted, forgetting where he was. The judge closed the folder, her mouth curving in a way I had never seen on a bench before. "Karma, son," she said simply. And in that moment, in the stunned quiet that followed, I finally breathed. Not in victory, not yet, but in the certainty that something had finally shifted in my favor. And to understand why that envelope existed, you'd have to know how the cracks in our story first formed. I wasn't always the woman who could walk into a courtroom filled with enemies and keep her chin high. Once I believed marriage meant partnership, meant choosing someone who would choose you back. I believed in honesty, in loyalty, and in Evan, more than I ever should have. The truth is, the three of them, Evan, Clara, and Lorraine, didn't become a united front overnight. Their bond had been tightening long before I realized it, threads of strategy and calculation weaving together right behind my back. I used to think Clara was just a financial advisor, Lorraine just an overbearing mother, and Evan just an overwhelmed husband. Now, seeing them lined up in court, all that arrogance and certainty spilling out of them, it was clear they moved as one. A well-practiced alliance. A quiet dynasty. Clara stood close to Evan as the clerk organized papers, whispering into his shoulder like they shared a private world. Lorraine examined me with the same polite disdain she wore the first day we met, as if she were deciding whether or not I was worthy of the family name she guarded like a fortress. And Evan, he wore triumph like a tailored suit, but triumph can look very similar to delusion. I sat down beside Adele, my attorney, who gave me a steady look. Not pity, not comfort, but confidence. A reminder that despite the performance unfolding on the other side of the room, I wasn't walking into this unarmed. The courtroom itself felt larger than usual. The ceilings too high, the lights too bright. Every footstep echoed. Every cough reverberated. It was the kind of room that could swallow a person whole if they weren't prepared. And that was precisely what Evan and his family expected, for me to wilt under the weight of their bravado. But I wasn't the same woman who once decorated our cottage while Evan promised me forever. I wasn't the same woman who used to apologize for asking questions, or shrink when Lorraine made comments wrapped in silk but filled with poison. I had learned. I had seen. And I had gathered every truth they prayed I'd never find. Clara clutched a thin silver folder marked with the Reeves family crest, something I'd never been allowed to touch. Lorraine kept her eyes forward, spine straight, shoulders prim, the matriarch ready to watch her plan unfold at last. Evan rolled his shoulders, loosening them as though preparing for a victory lap. They all believed they were walking into a predictable win. After all, they had built their case carefully, a narrative of instability, incompetence, and irrelevance, all projected onto me. A story where they were reasonable, and I was fragile. They expected tears, pleading, fear. What they didn't expect was silence, or stillness, or the envelope that was already unraveling everything they had engineered. A pause fell over the room, heavy and anticipatory. Evan glanced at me with a hint of confusion now, as if suddenly realizing something didn't match the script he had rehearsed. Clara's shoulders drew tight. Lorraine tapped her fingers against the table, the first sign of nerves I'd ever seen from her. The judge looked at us all, then at the folder again, then back at me, and I knew this was the beginning of their unraveling. But before that moment could ever happen, before the judge could laugh, before Evan could panic, before everything they built began to collapse, there was a time when none of this seemed possible. A time when I thought Evan's hand in mine meant safety. A time when I believed love could not be weaponized. Before the courtroom, before the envelope, before the truth had teeth. There was just him. I used to believe the beginning of our story was simple, gentle, almost cinematic. Now, looking back, I see how cleanly danger can hide inside charm. The weeks after that first encounter felt like pages from a romance I didn't know someone else was writing for me. Evan slipped into my life as if he had always belonged there. Morning texts, spontaneous coffee dates, soft compliments that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. I didn't know then that mirroring someone is easy when you've studied them long enough. I first met him at a Thanksgiving charity fundraiser, the kind held in small lakeside towns where fairy lights hang from rafters and neighbors gather like extended family. My aunt and I were running a booth sponsored by our little family business, arranging baked goods and hand-woven blankets under warm lantern light. The air smelled like cinnamon and cold autumn wind. Children darted between tables with donation jars clutched in mittened hands. Evan appeared like he'd stepped out of a holiday advertisement. Crisp coat, warm smile, the kind of presence that made people shift toward him without realizing. He approached because he saw me calming a child who'd dropped her pumpkin cookie and burst into tears. When the little girl sniffled and leaned into my side, Evan said, "Grace under pressure. Not everyone has that." I laughed, embarrassed but flattered. He introduced himself, and we fell into conversation with surprising ease. He asked about my family, my work, my grandmother, the matriarch whose influence shaped who I became. I told him pieces of my story without thinking twice. He listened as though every detail mattered. Then, for the first time, something flickered. His phone lit up in his hand. A name flashed across the screen just long enough for me to read it. L. Reeves. Evan flipped the phone over quickly and apologized. I didn't think much of it then. Reeves was a common last name, but the way he silenced the phone, swift, intentional, should have made me pause. Instead, he kept talking and I kept falling. He asked if my grandmother left me any traditions to keep alive. I answered honestly, saying she taught me to be independent, to build rather than borrow. He leaned in slightly. Did she leave you anything special? Something she hoped you'd carry forward? His interest struck me as unusually focused, but I mistook it for curiosity, not motive. We walked through the fundraiser beneath trees wrapped in glowing strands of light. My breath curled into the cold air, and he kept pace beside me like we'd done it 100 times. When he laughed at something I said, a warm rush went through me, the kind that makes you ignore tiny, quiet warnings. Then Lorraine arrived. I didn't know her name yet. I only knew she wore a tailored coat and pearls that caught the lamplight like frost. She moved with a kind of polished authority, the kind that suggested the world adjusted for her, not the other way around. Evan straightened the second he saw her. "This is my mother," he said, offering an affectionate smile I would later learn was mostly performance. Lorraine looked me over, her gaze slow and assessing, as though checking seams for flaws. "Your family business must keep you very occupied," she said. the pause long enough to remind me I wasn't imagining the condescension. I forced a polite smile. Busy, yes, but meaningful. She nodded once, still studying me. And your family owns land near the lake, I hear? That startled me. I hadn't mentioned the land. I hadn't mentioned anything about my grandmother's property. Evan jumped in quickly, laughing it off, saying he must have mentioned it once in passing. But Lorraine's eyes didn't leave mine. I felt something cold settle under my ribs. She mentioned a trusted financial advisor named Clara who couldn't attend, someone she relied on in all-important matters. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Had I known then what Clara truly meant to that family, I would have walked out of that fundraiser and never looked back. The night wound down in a warm blur. Evan walked me to my car, the gravel crunching beneath our feet, the wind brushing strands of hair across my cheek. He looked at me with striking intensity. I felt something tonight, he said softly. Tell me you did too. I did feel something. Something new, hopeful, bright. But as I opened my car door, he slipped in one more question. Casual on the surface, but sharp beneath. Have you ever thought of selling your grandmother's lakeside plot? I froze. I never mentioned that property. He hesitated just long enough to confirm he knew he'd slipped. Then he smiled smoothly. Oh, I looked up your family business earlier. Just curious. The explanation made sense in the moment, or at least I allowed it to. I didn't want to spoil the magic I thought we were creating, so I ignored the shiver that slid down my spine. We said goodnight, and as I drove away, the fundraiser lights faded behind me. My phone buzzed with a message from him. Coffee tomorrow morning, same time, same place. I smiled. I said yes. Years later, when everything had collapsed, when the courtroom walls echoed with the judge's laugh and Evan's shock, I would think back to that night. To Lorraine's cool appraisal, to the name on Evan's phone, to the question about my grandmother's land. I should have seen the first crack then, but some cracks are hairline thin, invisible until the entire structure begins to fall. The months after that fundraiser passed in a blur of warmth and certainty, as if Evan and I were racing toward a future we already believed belonged to us. He swept me into a rhythm I'd never known before. Spontaneous dinners, long walks beside the lake, nights spent talking about childhood memories and imagined futures. I mistook the speed for passion instead of strategy. Sometimes people don't rush because they're in love. Sometimes they rush because timing is everything. He proposed at sunrise on the lakeshore, kneeling in damp sand while the world glowed gold behind him. I remember thinking he looked almost unreal in that light, like something too perfect to question. My aunt cried when I told her the news. Lorraine, however, simply pressed a cool hand to my shoulder and said, "Let's hope you understand the responsibilities that come with joining a legacy." I brushed it off as old-fashioned formality. The wedding itself was lovely. A small ceremony overlooking the river, a soft breeze rolling off the water, the kind of day that photographs always exaggerate but didn't need to. Lorraine wore silver and pearls, her smile tight and calculated. At the reception, I spotted her speaking quietly to a distant cousin. When I walked nearer, her voice sharpened the way a knife does when it finds its edge. "She seems sweet," she said, "but sweetness doesn't last once paperwork gets involved." I froze, unsure whether to pretend I hadn't heard. Before I could decide, Evan appeared and wrapped his arm around me with practiced ease. "Ignore her," he whispered. "My mother still lives in a world where families marry for alliances." He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're different." I wanted to believe that. I did believe it then. We searched for houses almost immediately. Evan insisted it was important to build a home right away, somewhere worthy of our future family, though children were something we'd only brushed past in conversation. We toured bright new builds and old farmhouses, but he kept steering us back toward a riverside cottage with peeling paint and creaking floors. I fell in love with its bones, tall windows dusted with history, a porch that felt like it remembered stories. Evan, though, was strangely captivated by the property map pinned inside the listing folder. "This land has character," he said one afternoon, tracing boundary lines with his finger. Lorraine nodded approvingly, as if confirming her own unspoken agenda. When we finally bought it, I paid a large part of the down payment from the inheritance my grandmother left me. Evan kissed my forehead and murmured, "Our shared foundation." It felt romantic. Now I know it was literal. The real estate agent celebrated with us, but as we signed the final papers, Lorraine leaned in and asked casually, "And the plot near the lake? Is that included in your inheritance as well?" The question prickled my skin. "I think so," I said, uncertain why she cared. Her lips tightened. "Such assets carry great responsibility. Some people handle them better than others." I laughed nervously, unsure what else to do. Evan cut in before I could ask her what she meant, redirecting the conversation toward closing dates and renovation plans. The cottage needed love, and I poured myself into the renovations. I spent weeks sanding floors, choosing paint colors, sketching new layouts. Evan praised my vision endlessly, but he seemed far more interested in the old deeds, dusty drawers, and forgotten storage spaces left behind. Once I found him in the attic, flipping through a pile of brittle documents tied with twine. "Just curious about the history," he said lightly. "Old houses fascinate me." Maybe they did. But what fascinated him most were the boundaries, the surveys, the notes scribbled in margins by previous owners. He was studying our house the way one studies a chessboard. Lorraine's interest deepened, too. She began visiting frequently, gliding through rooms like she was evaluating them for her own use. One afternoon, as I tried to show her fabric samples for the living room curtains, she waved them aside. "I'm more curious about your grandmother," she said. "She must have been a formidable woman. Did she update her will before she passed?" The question felt invasive, but I smiled politely. "I only knew what my aunt told me. I never saw the full document." Lorraine's eyes flickered, a tiny spark of satisfaction, like someone confirming a suspicion. "Interesting," she murmured. "Older generations often forgot to keep things current." I didn't know what she meant, and she didn't explain. A week later, while reorganizing a storage closet, I found a faded file folder wedged behind a loose panel. My grandmother's maiden name was written across the front in her looping script. Inside were photocopied pages of a will, incomplete, edges worn, and 2 handwritten notes. "Not safe to keep here. Do not show Reeves' family." My breath caught. Reeves' family. Lorraine's family. I sat on the floor, my hands trembling as I reread the notes. I didn't understand the context, but the warning rang loud and unmistakable. When I showed Evan the folder that evening, he barely glanced at it before dismissing it. "These houses are full of old junk," he said. "Probably belonged to someone long before your grandmother. No need to worry Lorraine with it." He tried to take the file from me, but I pulled it back instinctively. "Fine," he said with a smile too smooth to trust. "If it makes you feel better, keep it." That was the moment something shifted. Not a break, not yet, but a hairline crack under the surface of everything I thought we were building together. In the weeks that followed, his schedule changed. He was gone more often, claiming meetings, investments, planning sessions. Lorraine began dropping by unannounced, letting herself in with a spare key I didn't know she had. Twice I found her opening drawers in the hallway desk. "Looking for thank you cards," she claimed, her voice pleasant and unreadable. I nodded, pretending to believe her. But late one night, alone in the dim kitchen with the folder I'd hidden behind cookbooks, I realized something true and heavy. The cottage wasn't the beginning of our life together. It was the battleground they'd chosen for mine to fall apart. Evan's company announced its first major investment deal on a windy Thursday afternoon, and something in him shifted overnight. He came home with a bottle of sparkling wine and 2 crystal glasses, insisting we celebrate even though he hated the taste of anything bubbly. He kissed my cheek distractedly and talked for almost an hour about next phases and legacy building, phrases that sounded more like boardroom jargon than the man I'd married. I told myself it was excitement, ambition. But deep down, something unsettled me. Legacy meant something different to the Reeves family. In the weeks that followed, Evan began to dress differently. Tailored suits, slick coats, watches that cost more than my monthly income. He said investors needed to see success to believe in it. He spent nights at the office, long weekends prepping for pitches, early mornings gone before I woke. Yet the financial stress he'd once mentioned vanished. He no longer complained about money. Instead, he spent lavishly. That would have been fine had he not started questioning every grocery purchase I made. "You bought artisan bread again?" he asked one evening, holding up a $5 receipt like it were the key item in a criminal case. Meanwhile, a new golf membership appeared on our joint account. I tried to laugh it off, but the contrast carved into me like a dull blade. One night, while setting the table, I overheard him on the phone. His voice was low, tense. "We need the Reeves Trust to stay out of sight until the merger is public," he said. "No one can connect the timing." I froze mid-step, a stack of plates in my hands. Trust? Merger? Sight? These were not words he used with me. Before I could make sense of the sentence, he shut the office door, locking it, something he never used to do. I stood there, the plates heavy, realizing I didn't know my husband's world anymore. A few days later, Lorraine arrived at the cottage with Clara in tow. Clara, the advisor I'd only heard mentioned in passing. She wore a fitted blazer and an effortless smile, the kind that said she was used to entering rooms she already believed she owned. "This is Clara," Lorraine said, giving Evan a proud glance. "She's been instrumental in guiding the family through this exciting transition." Clara shook my hand warmly. "I've heard so much about you." I doubted that. They toured the cottage as if assessing a property they intended to acquire. Clara admired the beams, the river views, the lot size, but when she reached the dining room window, she said something that rooted ice in my spine. "This land will be very valuable when the redevelopment plan goes through," I blinked. "Redevelopment plan?" Evan interrupted quickly. "Just an idea being tossed around, nothing firm." Clara's polite smile suggested otherwise. Lorraine added, "Some people can't see the potential right in front of them. Clara, however, sees the big picture." Her eyes slid to me. "Not everyone has that gift." I swallowed the sting. I tried to reclaim the space, offering tea, attempting polite conversation. But the two women floated through the house like they were discussing a project blueprint, not my home. Evan watched Clara with an attentiveness I hadn't seen in months, his expressions shifting subtly to match hers. I remembered the perfect alignment he'd shown during our dating days and felt a tremor move through me. Mirroring wasn't new for him. That night, Evan came home late, smelling faintly of citrus, not his scent, but Clara's. I had noticed her perfume earlier. I tucked the detail away. I wasn't ready to accuse, but I was done dismissing. A few days later, I found a receipt stuffed into Evan's jacket pocket while doing laundry. A dinner for two, at a private rooftop restaurant, with Clara's initials handwritten beside the reservation. When I asked, Evan didn't look up from his laptop. "It was business," he said. "Why are you acting insecure?" "I'm not insecure," I replied carefully. "I'm asking why you didn't tell me." He sighed dramatically. "This is what stress does. You're reading into nothing." Gaslighting, I would later learn, always begins with a tone of mild disappointment, as if your intuition is an inconvenience. The next week, I returned home early and heard murmurs in the living room. I recognized Lorraine's voice first, then Clara's, and finally Evan's. I moved quietly down the hallway and stopped just before the doorway. They were gathered around a table covered with land maps, including maps of my grandmother's properties. Clara tapped a section with her pen. "Once the consolidation is finalized, she won't have standing to contest anything." Lorraine nodded. "We must keep her unaware until the papers are filed." Evan didn't argue. He didn't defend me. He didn't even hesitate. I stepped back before they could see me, my pulse thundering in my ears. When I entered the room moments later, they jumped. Literally jumped. Lorraine immediately closed the folder, smiling tightly. "We were just helping Evan prepare for a pitch," she said. Clara added, "Financial modeling. Very boring." I nodded, pretending to believe them. My hands trembled behind my back. That evening, after everyone left, I found a business card placed neatly on my vanity. Clara's. On the back, a message written in looping script. "Some things aren't meant to be held onto forever." The words lodged under my skin like thorns. Evan shrugged when I confronted him. "Maybe she dropped it. Why are you making everything dramatic?" "Because everything was changing. Because everything felt staged. Because my home didn't feel like mine anymore." Days passed. Evan pulled further away. Lorraine criticized everything I did. The placement of dishes, the clothes I wore, the hours I worked. Clara's name appeared more often in Evan's conversations than my own. For the first time since our wedding, I truly felt alone. But not powerless, not yet broken. A marriage doesn't collapse in a single moment. It dissolves in quiet increments, invisible threads snapping one by one, until all that remains is the final break. And for us, that break began with a simple lie. A door locked during a phone call, a dinner reservation marked with initials, a message scrawled on the back of a business card. The worst part was still ahead. But the truth had already begun to surface, and soon even I wouldn't be able to deny what was coming. Evan's lie came wrapped in the same easy charm he used for everything. Smooth voice, casual shrug, the practiced calm of a man who never expected to be questioned. He stood in the doorway that morning with an overnight bag slung over his shoulder and announced he had to leave for a 2-day business trip, something about investors requesting an urgent meeting 3 hours away. I asked simple things: where he was staying, who else was going, whether he needed anything packed. But each question seemed to scrape his patience thinner. "It's just business, Ivy," he said, zipping the bag shut harder than necessary. "Don't make this into something it's not." He kissed my cheek out of habit, not affection, and walked out the door. As he stepped into the car, I noticed something strange. He'd packed far more than he ever took to work trips before: dress shirts, casual clothes, even gym wear. For a single investment meeting, it made no sense. But the lie wasn't in the luggage. It was in the way he didn't look back. He left before sunrise, and I made coffee, telling myself not to spiral. But an hour later, Lorraine arrived at the cottage without warning, letting herself in using a spare key I had no idea she possessed. She breezed into the kitchen as if the house belonged to her, commenting on the arrangement of the spice rack, the clutter on the counter, and the curtains I'd chosen. "Some choices are better suited for starter homes," she said, straightening a frame just enough to unsettle my nerves. "But you've done your best." I poured her tea to keep my hands busy. She sipped once, then said casually, "Evan and Clara must be exhausted with all this traveling." I froze. "Clara?" Lorraine blinked, as if surprised at her own slip. "Oh, didn't he tell you? She's helping him prepare investor materials during the trip." Her tone sharpened for just a moment, a quiet, razor-thin satisfaction. I didn't respond quickly enough, and she sensed it. "You must understand, dear. Some roles require different strengths." She brushed non-existent dust from her sleeve. "Evan needs people who elevate him." I wanted to ask what that made me, but she answered the question before I voiced it, with silence and a smile. When she finally left, I stood in the doorway long after her car disappeared down the road, the cold air biting my arms. Something inside me was beginning to fracture. Later that afternoon, I logged into our joint bank account to pay utilities. A red notification flashed across the screen. "Your access status has changed." I clicked it, heartbeat quickening. My name was no longer listed as a primary account holder. Evan had changed it the week before. The bank representative explained it politely over the phone. "Your husband said this was a temporary adjustment for investor confidence. Funds over a certain amount require his authorization now. As if I were a child with an allowance. I hung up, hands shaking, and dialed Evan. He answered on speaker, background chatter muffling his words. "You changed the account," I said. "It's temporary," he replied, irritation already simmering. "I told you, complex business stuff. Don't get emotional. I'm asking for an explanation." "And I'm asking for trust," he snapped. "If you can't handle the pressure I'm under, maybe step back instead of adding more." The call ended with static ringing in my ears. I drove to the market just to get out of the house, needing to breathe air that wasn't heavy with confusion. While comparing apples, I overheard two women chatting near the bread aisle. "Oh, Evan Reeves was at lunch the other day," one said brightly. "With that gorgeous advisor, Clara? They looked so close. His mom was there too, looked like a family meeting." A cold rush swept through me. Family meeting, not business, not investors, family. I left my basket behind. At home, I headed straight for the file cabinet where we kept important documents. I don't know what I was looking for, only that I had to look. I tugged open the drawer and felt my stomach drop. The folder containing the cottage deed, the one with both our names, was gone. In its place sat a new blue folder neatly labeled Reeves Consolidation Phase 2. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a drafted deed transferring majority ownership of the cottage to Evan alone. Notes in the margins read, "She will not contest if presented properly. Proceed once removal is initiated. Non-essential spouse." My breath hitched. They weren't just planning behind my back. They were scripting my disappearance from everything I'd built, everything my grandmother had worked for, everything tied to my name. I took photos of every page. Just as I slid the folder back, headlights swept across the living room window. Evan's car pulling into the driveway. He walked in carrying a gift bag, acting like nothing was wrong. "I brought you something," he said, pulling out an expensive silk scarf. "Thought you'd like it." The citrus perfume clinging to him wasn't mine, or the soap from hotel showers. It was Clara's, the same notes I'd smelled on her blazer at the cottage days earlier. "How was the trip?" I asked, forcing steady breath. He shrugged. "Fine, productive." "Was Clara helpful?" He froze for the slightest moment, too short to catch if I didn't know him so well. "Don't start this again," he sighed. "I'm doing everything I can for us." Us. A word that now felt like a stranger in my mouth. We ate in near silence, and that night, as I lay awake listening to the hum of the river outside, a realization settled into me so quietly, so deeply, that it hurt. My marriage wasn't falling apart from distance or stress or miscommunication. It was being dismantled, deliberately, strategically, piece by piece. And the people pulling it apart were the very ones who stood at the altar with me, who toasted our future, who smiled in photographs that now felt like lies pressed between glass. I didn't know everything yet, but I knew enough. The worst was still coming. And soon, I would stop trying to hold a marriage together and start trying to save myself. The winter gala had always been woven into the Reeves family mythology. A night of glittering speeches, philanthropic posing, and strategic networking disguised as holiday cheer. In years past, Evan and I attended arm in arm, presenting ourselves like any ambitious young couple. But this year, I felt the crack beneath our feet widening with every passing hour. Still, I chose my red dress carefully, not knowing it would become a symbol of the night everything changed. When we arrived at the Grand Hotel ballroom, the chandeliers shone like shattered ice overhead. The walls dripped with silver garlands, and a string quartet played near the entryway. It should have felt magical. Instead, it felt staged. A set built for a performance I hadn't been given the script for. Evan stood beside me, handsome and hollow, offering a compliment that sounded memorized. Clara appeared before I could reply, brushing a hand along his arm as though claiming a familiar space. She wore a bracelet I recognized, one I had once found tucked in the back of Evan's drawer, where he insisted it was a client's he'd accidentally brought home. It glittered on her wrist like a quiet confession. Lorraine drifted toward us in a charcoal gown, her pearls gleaming. "Well," she said, looking me over, "red is a bold choice. Some people prefer to blend in when the stakes are high, but I suppose subtlety was never your strength." I held her gaze. "I didn't realize I was meant to blend in." "Of course not," she said with a small smile that felt like a blade. "Some roles require understanding, others require acceptance." I didn't know what that meant, but I felt Clara's eyes lingering on me, amused, certain. After a round of obligatory greetings, I excused myself to the restroom to breathe. The strap of my dress slipped, so I ducked behind a velvet curtain that hid a short backstage hall. I'd knelt to fix the clasp when voices floated toward me. Sharp, urgent, unmistakable. Evan, Clara, and Lorraine. "She won't understand the agreement," Clara was saying. "If she sees it before the transfer is finalized, we lose leverage." Lorraine responded, crisp and cold. "Then sign it now. The consolidation must be sealed before she gets wise. Timing is everything." A soft rustle, then Evan's voice. "I just think, enough thinking," Lorraine snapped. "You've stalled long enough. Sign." I heard a pen click, paper sliding, a sigh, Evan's. My whole body stilled. I leaned closer, hardly breathing. "We proceed Monday," Clara said. "As planned, Ivy will have no legal standing left." I stepped back slowly, silently, heart pounding in my throat. They weren't just sidestepping me, they were eliminating me. When I finally emerged into the ballroom, the room spun. The orchestra swelled into a holiday waltz, and guests toasted with flutes of champagne, oblivious to the conspiracy unfolding behind velvet curtains. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, my fingers trembling against the stem of my glass. And then came the toast. Lorraine stepped forward, microphone in hand, glowing with matriarchal pride. "Tonight," she began, "we celebrate not only generosity, but vision. The future of our family's legacy is brighter than ever." She turned to Evan and Clara, beaming. "I want to recognize the extraordinary partnership between my son and Clara Reeves." The crowd murmured. I blinked. "Reeves?" Clara stepped forward modestly. "Oh, it's nothing, truly." "Nonsense," Lorraine said. "Your strategic guidance has shaped the next generation of our holdings. It takes true wisdom to know who belongs at the helm, and who supports quietly from home." Eyes darted toward me. My throat tightened. Evan smiled at Clara, not bothering to disguise the familiarity. He didn't look at me at all. I stood perfectly still, letting humiliation settle over my skin like snowfall, cold, quiet, suffocating. After the toast, I drifted toward the dessert table, trying to escape the whispers. A hotel employee approached, glancing nervously around before stepping closer. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I shouldn't be saying this, but be careful." I frowned. Careful of what? "They asked about security protocols for property documents," he whispered. "Said you were unstable, that you might misplace important things. I'm sorry. I thought you should know." My breath caught. Lorraine's lies, Clara's manipulations, Evan's signature on whatever he'd signed backstage. They were setting the stage to strip me of everything. I left the table abruptly and entered the crowd, searching for Evan. I found him laughing with Clara near the dance floor, their heads close, shoulders brushing. The music softened as couples paired up. Then Evan turned to me, extending a hand. "Dance!" I took it, steady, composed. If they wanted a performance, I would give them one. As we moved across the floor, he whispered, "Tonight is important. Don't make things difficult." I looked up at him, at the man who had promised forever, and saw the stranger he had become. Across the room, Clara watched us, confident, expectant, certain of her role in whatever was unfolding. "You look like you have something to say," Evan murmured. I forced a small smile. "Not tonight." Because tonight was not for confrontation. Tonight was for clarity. I let him guide me through one final turn, then stepped away, my hand slipping from his as gently as a severed thread. I didn't leave the ballroom in anger. I left with purpose. When I stepped into the cold night air, the city lights reflecting on the river below, one truth settled into place. They weren't just pushing me out of my marriage. They were preparing to erase me completely. But they'd made one mistake. The kind people make when they believe themselves untouchable. They underestimated the woman who had finally stopped looking at them with love and started looking at them with clarity. The morning after the winter gala felt like waking from a dream that had curdled into a warning. My red dress lay draped over the chair where I'd dropped it hours earlier, the fabric wrinkled and heavy, as if it had absorbed every humiliation of the night before. I stared at it in the quiet of the cottage, at the faint shimmer along the hem, and felt something inside me shift, not break, but harden. I needed answers, real ones. Not the polished lies Evan fed me, not the veiled insinuations Lorraine used like scalpels, not the faux warmth Clara wrapped around every calculated smile. The first place to look was Clara herself. I spent the morning searching through public records, cross-checking addresses, business filings, anything that could reveal who she really was. Her resume was vague, too vague for someone who apparently helmed half of the Reeves family's financial decisions. After an hour of digging, I found her listed residence, a high-rise luxury apartment downtown with views of the river. It was far beyond what a consultant with her listed income should afford. I drove there, parking across from the entrance. I stayed in the car at first, watching people come and go until I finally saw her emerge from a sleek black sedan. Clara walked with the confidence of someone born into privilege, not someone hired to support it. She flashed a keycard at the doorman, who greeted her with, "Morning, Ms. Reeves's advisor." Reeves. That name again. It seemed to follow every shadow in my life since joining their family. I slipped into the lobby as she disappeared into the elevator. The marble floors gleamed and the walls smelled faintly of lemon polish and money. I approached the concierge with the air of someone searching for a friend. "Excuse me," I said, feigning casual. "I'm trying to surprise my friend who lives here. Clara. I didn't catch her apartment number." The concierge smiled politely. "We don't give out resident information." I nodded, as though I expected that. Before I could retreat, a delivery worker walked up beside me, packages stacked in his arms. "For Ms. Clara?" the worker asked the concierge. "She picked up the trust paperwork this morning," the concierge said. "You can leave those in the office." My breath caught. Trust paperwork. "What trust?" I asked before I could stop myself. The worker shrugged. "Reeves family stuff. They're always signing something." Something cold crept up my spine. The gala conversation echoed in my mind: consolidation, timing, leverage. Later that afternoon, I spotted Clara leaving the building and followed her discreetly to a boutique law office tucked between a wine bar and a jeweler. I lingered near the entrance, pretending to scroll my phone. Through the glass, I saw her arguing with a young associate, her expression tight. "You don't understand," Clara hissed. "Lorraine wants this finalized. If Evan's wife contests it, the timeline falls apart." My heart thudded. Wife. Contest. Timeline. The associate lowered his voice. "The unborn heir trust isn't a small matter. If she finds out, she won't," Clara snapped. "By the time she realizes what's happening, the transfer will be done." Unborn heir trust. The words struck like a blow. I moved back, stunned. They weren't just planning to remove me. They were planning a future child who would inherit everything that should have been protected by my marriage, my grandmother's wishes, and the land she entrusted to me. A child I would never be mother to, because I was never meant to be part of their legacy. Not love, not partnership, a placeholder, a bridge. I left before they could see me, breathing hard, gripping my coat against a wind that suddenly felt sharp. Driving home, I passed a cafe where Evan sat at an outdoor table with an old friend from college. something made me stop. I parked and quietly approached the patio, staying behind a row of hedges where their voices drifted clearly through the winter air. Ivy wasn't supposed to be part of this long term, Evan said, stirring his drink lazily. Once the consolidation is done, everything will finally be back in Reeves' hands. His friend raised a brow. And if she fights the divorce rumors your mother keeps hinting at? Evan laughed, a low, careless sound that twisted something inside me. She doesn't have the spine to fight us. Us. Not him, not his mother, not Clara. Us. A coalition I had never been invited into, even as I stood beside him at the altar. I walked away before I could hear more, before rage could swallow me whole. Back at the cottage, I went straight to the attic. If my grandmother had left warnings, maybe she'd left more than that. I dug through boxes of holiday decorations, old quilts, mismatched china. Finally, at the bottom of an old cedar chest, beneath bundles of letters tied with string, I found an envelope marked only with her initials. Inside were 3 letters between my grandmother and an attorney. They were heavily redacted but mentioned boundary disputes, mineral rights, and a woman named Lorraine Reeves challenging the estate decades earlier. Phrases jumped out like embers. Contested land use. Potential long-term conflict. Keep documents private. Do not trust the Reeves influence. My breath shook as I pieced together the truth. This wasn't a new feud. It had been simmering long before I ever met Evan. Lorraine had wanted my grandmother's land, and whatever lay beneath it, for decades. And the easiest way to take it from me was to marry her son into my inheritance, and then cut me out once the legal pathways were in place. I sat on the attic floor, my back against the cedar chest, surrounded by letters that turned my entire marriage into a calculated maneuver. I had not been loved, I had been targeted. And as I stared at the ink my grandmother left behind, it became painfully clear. The Reeves family didn't just want me gone from their legacy, they wanted my legacy absorbed into theirs. I closed my eyes, exhaled, and let the last pieces of denial crumble. When I opened them again, something sharper and stronger had taken their place. They thought I would break quietly. But I was done being quiet. I woke before sunrise the next morning, the sky still bruised with fading night. The attic documents lay spread across the kitchen table, their edges curling under the weight of time and secrets. I stared at them with a numb kind of clarity. All the pieces were there, the trust, the land disputes, the signatures that weren't mine. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was simply done pretending that any of this could be fixed with apologies or explanations. My grandmother once told me that certain families don't chase wealth, they chase control. Back then, I thought she meant political power or business influence. I never imagined she meant the Reeves family, or that her warning would one day echo inside my marriage like a prophecy. A sliver of memory rose, uninvited but sharp. I was 19, sitting at the cottage kitchen table while my grandmother shredded a letter with shaking hands. "Some things," she'd whispered, "are safer broken than read by the wrong people." I'd laughed nervously, brushing her worry aside. She was old, she was tired. She'd lived too long with burdens I thought belonged to the past. But the memory of her ripping that letter, flushing it piece by piece, returned now with a heaviness that nearly buckled my knees. She had known. She had always known. I grabbed my coat and the folder of documents and drove straight to Adele Morgan's office. The building was quiet, a converted Victorian painted slate blue, the kind that looked sturdy enough to hold other people's secrets. Adele welcomed me inside with a steady, perceptive glance. "Show me," she said simply. I laid everything out, the photocopied will fragments, the land surveys, the letters referencing disputes with Lorraine Reeves, and the notes I'd taken on Clara and Evan's activities. Adele read silently at first, her eyes narrowing in concentration. When she spoke, her voice was calm but razor-sharp. "This isn't divorce strategy, Ivy. This is acquisition." A cold ripple moved through me. Acquisition of what? The land? Not just the land, she said. The mineral rights beneath it. The commercial value. The long-term leverage. Your grandmother's inheritance wasn't just sentimental. It's worth millions in the right hands. And the Reeves family seems to have known that long before you did. I felt the room tilt. I never knew. Of course you didn't, Adele said softly. They made sure you didn't. She asked about the missing pages of the will, and I explained where I'd found the warning scribbles. She examined them carefully, then nodded. We'll need the rest of the will, or proof of its contents. If your grandmother anticipated this, she may have hidden it. I've looked, I said, frustration in my voice. But maybe not carefully enough. Adele tapped a pencil thoughtfully. Find everything she left behind. Every scrap, every letter, and keep it all out of the Reeves' reach. This is bigger than your marriage. I inhaled slowly. I know. Before I left, she called someone into the office, a private investigator named Halden, a sharp-featured man with a calm, methodical presence. Mrs. Reeves, he began. Winters, I corrected automatically. For now. Adele gave him the folder. Follow every thread. I want proof of manipulation, trust fraud, and property interference. He nodded. I'll start tonight. I returned to the cottage with a new sense of purpose, but also a heaviness that settled deep in my bones. When I reached the attic again, I tore through every box, every drawer, every false panel I could find. Dust coated my fingers, my hair, my breath. Hours passed, the afternoon sun shifting across the floorboards. Then I found it, a thin leather-bound journal lodged behind the cedar chest. Inside, tucked between pages of pressed flowers, was a letter from my grandmother, written in her familiar hand. My dearest Ivy, if they ever come for this land again, remember, what they want is not what you can see, but what lies beneath. Protect it the way I protected you. And trust no one who carries the Reeves name. My hands trembled as I read it again. Beneath. Mineral rights. She had been fighting this battle decades before I even met Evan. And Lorraine had never stopped. I pressed the letter to my chest and let the truth settle into place. The Reeves family had not stumbled into conflict with me. They had groomed the opportunity. Evan wasn't simply a man who betrayed his wife. He was the son of a family who saw me as a gatekeeper to something they wanted. That evening, Halden called. I found something, he said. Lorraine hired her own investigator months ago. A file is being built to portray you as emotionally unstable. Statements from neighbors, photos taken without your knowledge, financial notes manipulated to make you look reckless. My scalp prickled. Why? To remove your legal standing, Halden said. If you look incompetent, your signature doesn't hold weight. You can't contest inheritance claims. You can't defend property transfers. So that was their plan. To erase me legally, financially, socially, until the land was theirs. And I was nothing. I hung up and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the river that had once soothed me. The cottage creaked softly, as if my grandmother's presence lingered still. I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Anger burned, yes, hot and clean, but beneath it was something steadier, clarity, purpose, resolve. I whispered into the dim room, You picked the wrong woman. I gathered the letters, maps, journal pages, and warnings into a single stack, holding them with both hands like a shield. If they wanted a war, they would have one. Just not the kind they expected. And I knew, with a certainty that felt like steel, that the envelope I would bring into that courtroom would not just defend my rights. It would dismantle everything the Reeves family had spent decades trying to build. I didn't realize how much strength could gather in silence until I sat alone at the attic desk that morning, the manila envelope beside me like a heartbeat waiting to happen. I wasn't trembling anymore. I wasn't confused or overwhelmed. I felt carved into something sharper, steadier. A woman who finally understood the truth and was ready to fight for it. I'm not just gathering evidence, I whispered into the stillness. I'm reclaiming everything you tried to take. Adele's team moved quickly. At her direction, I created a secret workspace in the attic. one Evan never bothered to climb into. I sorted documents, photos, letters, maps, each piece part of a puzzle the Reeves family had counted on me never assembling. The envelope grew heavier by the hour, its weight meaning more than paper. By mid-morning, the forensic accountant, Mr. Caldwell, called with his first findings. His voice was crisp, professional. "Mrs. Winters, the transfers are not subtle." "What transfers?" I asked, bracing myself. "Funds from Evan's company have been quietly funneled into Reeves family holdings. They're labeled as operational fees, but the amounts don't match any real expenses." I gripped the desk edge. They were moving money out of the company? "Not just moving it," Caldwell said. "Hiding it. Shifting shared marital assets into Reeves-only accounts. This is textbook asset shielding before a divorce." A cold calm spread through me. "They anticipated my removal." "Yes," he said. "Long before now." I thanked him and hung up, sitting in the attic's dusty light as the truth settled deeper. Evan hadn't fallen out of love or grown distant by accident. He had been preparing. Halden, the private investigator, called next. "Ivy," he said, and for the first time his voice sounded urgent. "You need to hear this." I felt the prick of dread. "What did you find?" "Clara doesn't just live in that luxury apartment you saw. She has access to a second one, paid for by a shell company under the Reeves umbrella." I inhaled sharply. "What's in the second apartment?" "Boxes labeled Reeves Mineral Holdings, and a locked cabinet with the family crest. I've photographed everything." My pulse thudded. Mineral rights. The very thing my grandmother had warned about. The Reeves family wasn't hiding sentiment. They were hiding an empire. "And Evan?" I asked quietly. Halden hesitated. "He visited that apartment multiple times before your wedding." I closed my eyes, the truth slicing cleanly now. "So they planned this even earlier?" "Yes," Halden said. "Clara wasn't brought in after your marriage. She was positioned before it." That hurt more than I expected. Not heartbreak, but insult. I hadn't been loved. I'd been scouted. When the call ended, I turned back to the desk, determined to keep going. My hands no longer shook. They moved with purpose. Hours later, Halden returned with another discovery. A USB drive containing a digital folder Lorraine had compiled. Inside were staged photographs of disorganized rooms, fabricated expense summaries, and statements implying I was emotionally unstable. A competency attack, a strategy to discredit me, invalidate my signature, erase my standing. She wanted the court to believe I couldn't manage my own life, let alone inherited land worth millions. I stared at the screen, anger burning hot but clean. Lorraine had constructed an entire narrative to justify what they planned to take. But something she didn't know, I now had the truth she feared most. By late afternoon, I returned to the attic for one last search through the cedar chest. My grandmother had hidden pieces of her story everywhere, and I trusted her more than anyone else. I pushed aside quilts and tins and yellowed receipts until my fingers brushed the back panel of the chest. It shifted. My breath caught. Behind it, tucked flat, were the missing pages of the will. I slid them out, heart pounding. The handwriting was unmistakable. My grandmother's firm, elegant script. She named me sole heir. She forbade transfer of the land to the Reeves family. She referenced threats, pressure, and a long-standing attempt to force her into selling. At the bottom, a single handwritten note. "Keep this safe. They must never own what you were born to protect." My throat tightened. I pressed the pages to my chest, tears blurring the ink I refused to let fall. This was the proof Lorraine had spent decades trying to bury. The proof Evan had married into. The proof Clara was helping conceal. I scanned the pages immediately, backing them up to encrypted files Adele had set up. Then I printed them, sliding the originals gently into the envelope. That envelope was no longer paper. It was justice. I sat back in the attic, surrounded by every truth they hoped to bury. Fraudulent transfers, shell companies, a second apartment, a fabricated competency file, the recovered will, the mineral rights they wanted to steal. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed one undeniable image. They hadn't misjudged me. They had miscalculated themselves. As evening settled, the cottage quieted, just the river humming outside. I added the final document to the envelope, smoothed the flap, and pressed it shut with a firm, steady hand. A vibration buzzed against the desk, a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging. You're making a mistake you won't recover from." I stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone down. "No," I whispered. "You are." I picked up the envelope, feeling its weight settle into my palms like the beginning of something unstoppable. When the courtroom doors opened in a few days, I wouldn't walk in as the broken woman they expected. I would walk in carrying everything they deserved to fear. The cottage felt unnervingly quiet that night, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stood in the living room with the envelope in my hands, its weight unfamiliar yet strangely steady, like something alive. Tomorrow everything would come to light, the lies, the schemes, the years of manipulation wrapped in polite smiles. I wasn't afraid of the courtroom anymore. I was only afraid of losing myself before I made it there. Evan came home humming, of all things. A low, content tune, as if he'd just finished a pleasant dinner rather than preparing to crush his wife in court. He tossed his keys on the counter and loosened his tie, turning toward me with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said, pouring himself a drink, "big day tomorrow." I didn't respond. He sipped slowly, watching me over the rim of the glass. "My lawyer thinks it'll be straightforward," he continued, as if discussing weekend errands. "The judge will see reason, and once the house is back in my name, things will settle down." "The house," I repeated quietly. He tapped the glass against his palm. "And everything that goes with it. You'll thank me someday when you're in a place better suited to your needs." I felt the words hit, one by one. But something in me no longer bent. I lifted my chin. "If you say so, Evan." He frowned, thrown off by my calm. He wanted panic, wanted tears, wanted proof his narrative was working. Instead, he got silence. "Lorraine and Clara will be at the hearing," he added, "just to ensure everything goes smoothly." Of course they would. They had choreographed the downfall they imagined for me. He waited for a reaction, and when none came, he finished his drink, irritated. "Try not to embarrass yourself tomorrow." He walked past me without another word, but for the first time his confidence felt thin. A moment later, Clara let herself in without knocking, a habit she'd adopted as if waiting for the house to become hers. She held a folder pressed to her chest, but her poise cracked the moment her phone pinged. She glanced at the screen and paled. "Is something wrong?" I asked lightly. "It's nothing," she said too quickly, smoothing her blouse. "Just routine oversight, family trust matters." Her voice trembled. For the first time since meeting her, I felt a shift, a hairline crack in her composure. She muttered under her breath, unaware that I heard, "She wasn't supposed to find anything." I pretended not to notice. Let paranoia do what honesty couldn't. Lorraine arrived next, sweeping into the cottage as if it were an estate she intended to reclaim. Her eyes flicked over the rooms with the hunger of someone confirming inventory. "Well," she said, removing her gloves, "tomorrow will bring clarity for everyone." She circled me slowly, like a jeweler examining a flawed stone. "You look pale, dear. Nervous?" "No." She raised an eyebrow. "You should be." Without waiting, she opened her purse and pulled out a document. "I've submitted a competency concern to the court," she said, savoring each word. "Judges take emotional instability very seriously." I smiled, a small cold thing that made her still. "You should have made your lies more consistent." Her expression faltered in a way I'd never seen. For 1 second it was she who looked nervous. "It doesn't matter," she snapped, regaining composure. "Tomorrow, everything your grandmother hoarded becomes ours. The land, the value beneath it, all of it." There it was. The truth she'd been circling for months. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Lorraine turned on her heel and left without saying goodbye. Clara followed, shooting one last uneasy glance over her shoulder. When the door closed, I called Adele. She answered immediately, as if expecting me. "Everything is ready," she said. "Remember, let them speak first. Let them posture. Judges are perceptive." "I won't lose control." "I know you won't," Adele replied. "They think they've written your story. Tomorrow you hand them the ending they deserve." I thanked her quietly. She paused, then softened her voice. "Ivy, you've already won the hardest battle." After the call, I wandered through the cottage, the house I had loved long before Evan stepped into my life. Every room carried memories, good and painful. The kitchen where he told me I spent too much, the hallway where Lorraine critiqued everything from my posture to my potential, the living room where Clara's citrus perfume lingered too often. I stopped at the bookshelf, where something thin and familiar peeked from behind a row of old novels. My grandmother's handwriting, looping, firm, unmistakable, covered the front of a folded note. "Protect what is yours. They will try everything." A lump rose in my throat. I pressed the note to my chest and let the warmth of her strength settle into me. Upstairs, I placed the envelope beside my bed. The night felt too still, too expectant. The moon cast pale light across the room, illuminating the edges of my resolve. A soft knock tapped against the door. Evan peeked inside, wearing the expression he'd used 1,000 times when he wanted something. "We don't have to make a scene tomorrow," he said gently. "Just sign the settlement tonight, and this can be easier." I met his eyes. "Tomorrow will be a scene you'll never forget." His face tightened, the first real crack in his certainty. He stepped back, almost stumbling, then left without another word. I lay down, the envelope beside me, as if guarding it with my breath. Outside, the river whispered under the moonlight, a sound that once soothed me, but now sounded like a promise. "They took everything they could," I whispered into the dark. "Tomorrow, I take it back." And as sleep finally pulled me under, I felt no fear, only the calm before a storm I was finally ready to unleash. The courthouse steps felt colder than the morning air as I climbed them, the envelope tucked beneath my arm like a second heartbeat. My boots echoed against the stone, steady and deliberate. I wasn't walking into this building as the woman Evan expected, frightened, fragile, apologetic. I walked in as someone they had spent months shaping without realizing it, someone who no longer feared them. Inside, Evan, Lorraine, and Clara stood together near the plaintiff's table, dressed in coordinated blacks and silvers like they were attending a gala instead of a legal reckoning. Evan's posture radiated smugness. Lorraine adjusted her pearls with ceremonial precision. Clara held a thin silver folder, her knuckles white against its edge. A shift rippled through them as I approached. Not fear, not yet, but confusion. I wasn't slumped or broken. I wasn't avoiding their eyes. I met each gaze head on. That alone unsettled them. Evan forced a laugh. "You look calm." "I am." He blinked, unsure how to respond. Lorraine leaned to Clara and whispered something that made Clara's lips tighten. They were already recalibrating, trying to understand what they'd missed. Their attorney approached next, giving me a patronizing smile that felt rehearsed. "Mrs. Winters," he said, "I trust we'll handle this efficiently. There's no need for dramatics." I didn't answer. I just took my seat beside Adele, who greeted me with a nod that said everything. "We're ready." When the judge entered, the courtroom rose. Something in her gaze was sharper than I expected, as if she could sense the weight of what was about to unfold. We sat. Evan's lawyer began with rehearsed confidence, painting me as unstable, irrational, financially irresponsible, and unsupportive of the Reeves family legacy. He presented the falsified competency file Lorraine had constructed, sliding it across the judge's bench with a flourish. "Your Honor," he said, This demonstrates precisely why Mr. Winters seeks full ownership of the marital home, the associated land, and all relevant assets. Mrs. Winters has displayed repeated emotional volatility. Volatility, I murmured under my breath. Adele touched my hand lightly, a reminder to stay silent. The lawyer continued, Mr. Winters only wishes to protect his investments, his family's future, and the estate that rightfully belongs within Reeves' lineage. Adele stood before he could finish. Your Honor, the opposing counsel has offered a narrative. We have facts. The judge gestured for her to proceed. Adele began calmly, methodically. First, regarding the claim of instability. She lifted the competency file. This document contains photographs and statements gathered illegally and deceptively. We have evidence these were staged by Mrs. Lorraine Reeves and collected without Mrs. Winters' knowledge. She handed the judge a packet. The judge flipped through it, brow tightening. Clara looked at Lorraine sharply, but Lorraine refused to look back. Second, Adele continued, we present financial records showing irregular transfers from Mr. Winters' company into Reeves Family Holdings. Transfers labeled inaccurately as operational fees, the courtroom murmured. Evan stiffened. These transfers, Adele said, were timed precisely around marital discord Mr. Winters orchestrated. Adele clicked a remote, and a screen lit up with highlighted transactions. Evan started to stand. That's taken out of... Sit down, the judge ordered without looking at him. I saw the first flash of panic in his eyes. Adele moved on. Third, we provide evidence of multiple shell companies controlled by the Reeves family, one of which pays for Ms. Clara's secondary residence. Clara's face drained of color. Her grip on the folder weakened. Adele slid photos onto the judge's bench. Images Halden had captured of boxes labeled Reeves Mineral Holdings and documents matching the trust scheme. Fourth, Adele said, we submit into evidence the historical land dispute between Mrs. Winters' grandmother and the Reeves family, proving long-term intent to acquire the inherited lakefront property and the mineral rights beneath it. Lorraine couldn't stay silent anymore. This is outrageous. Be quiet, the judge snapped. Adele produced the will pages next, the ones my grandmother had hidden decades earlier. These documents, she said, show that Mrs. Winters is the sole heir to the land in question. They also include a handwritten note, "Do not show Reeves family." The judge read the note twice. Lorraine's face went sheet white. Clara stared at her, stunned. Evan jolted forward, voice raised. This is being twisted. I was misled. I didn't know. Adele lifted a small device. Your Honor, we also submit audio obtained legally from a public conversation between Mr. Winters and a witness. The recording played through the speakers. Evan's voice clear as glass. Ivy wasn't supposed to be part of this long term. Once the consolidation is done, everything will be back in Reeves' hands. A gasp rippled through the room. Evan froze. Lorraine turned toward him with horror. Clara closed her eyes. And then Adele stepped back, nodding at me. My cue. I rose, walked to the bench, and placed my envelope gently before the judge. She opened it, flipping through each document slowly. The fraudulent trust drafts, emails between Lorraine and Clara discussing my removal, boundary maps, property tampering instructions, mineral rights valuations, the photos from the second apartment. Silence pressed down on the room. And then, just as it had the first moment I saw her do it, the judge laughed. It was brief, incredulous, but unmistakably real. Evan's voice cracked. What's funny? The judge closed the folder, leaned back and said, Karma, son. You could have heard a pin drop. In light of this evidence, she continued, I order an immediate freeze on all Reeves family accounts, a full investigation into these fraudulent activities, protection of Mrs. Winters' inheritance, and temporary sole control of the marital home awarded to Mrs. Winters. Lorraine's mouth fell open. Clara stared at the floor. Evan looked as if the ground had dropped out from under him. The judge banged her gavel. Court is adjourned." As I gathered my things, Evan whispered, voice shaking with something between rage and disbelief, "You ruined everything." I turned to him calmly. "No, you did." And for the first time in months, I walked away feeling weightless. Like a woman stepping out of a storm, she'd finally learned how to survive. The weeks after our wedding passed in a warm, hopeful blur, the kind of blissful stretch of time that makes you believe the foundation beneath you is solid. Evan and I settled into married life as if we'd been rehearsing it for years. I decorated the cottage with fabrics and colors that reminded me of my grandmother's home, while Evan spoke enthusiastically about our future, children, vacations, traditions we'd create together. For a while, I let myself believe the life we were building was real. But even perfect beginnings can hide fractures thin as hairlines. Our wedding had been small but beautiful, held on a bluff overlooking the river. My aunt cried through the vows, and Evan squeezed my hand so tightly I felt the promise in my bones. But at the reception, Lorraine's embrace was colder than her smile suggested. She leaned close enough that I felt her breath against my ear. "Marriage," she whispered, "requires understanding your place in a legacy." The words didn't register as a threat then, just another comment from a woman who saw the world through hierarchies. It was later, when I overheard her speaking with a distant cousin, that something inside me prickled. "She seems sweet," Lorraine murmured, swirling champagne in her glass. "But sweetness rarely survives once paperwork becomes involved." I stiffened, unsure whether I should interrupt. Before I made a choice, Evan pulled me away with a laugh, telling his cousin not to fill my head with Reeves traditions. He kissed the top of my head, but his jaw was slightly clenched, as if he already knew the battle lines his mother envisioned. We began house hunting within weeks. Evan insisted on it. "A married couple needs a real home," he said, though we'd barely finished unpacking wedding gifts. We toured modern condos and sprawling new builds, but he kept steering us toward an aging riverside cottage with peeling paint and floors that groaned under each step. I saw charm in its flaws immediately. Evan, however, seemed strangely fascinated by the land survey pinned to the listing packet. "This plot extends farther than it looks," he murmured, finger tracing the boundary lines. Lorraine nodded approvingly. "A historical property is far more valuable than a shiny new one, especially when the land has future potential." I blinked at her. "Future potential?" She smiled tightly. "Old families understand these things." I didn't know what that meant, and no one offered to explain. We bought the cottage a month later. I contributed most of the down payment using what my grandmother had left me. It felt right, using her legacy to build my own. Evan kissed me when we signed the papers, murmuring, "Our forever home." But the way Lorraine studied the deed suggested she saw something very different in the future. Renovations began immediately, my sanctuary, my project. I spent hours sanding the worn floors, choosing soft blues and creams for the walls, arranging the furniture with intention and love. Evan complimented everything, but his interest always drifted toward the structural elements, the attic beams, the cellar foundation, the property boundaries. He wandered with the blueprint often folded in his hands, muttering quietly to himself. One evening, I found him in the attic flipping through a stack of yellowed documents tied with twine. When he saw me, he smiled too quickly. "Just curious about the history," he said. "This house has stories." His tone was light, but he tucked the documents away before I could see them. Something about the gesture made the air shift. Lorraine's involvement deepened, too. She visited unannounced, gliding through rooms with the proprietary air of someone checking on an investment. She criticized my paint choices, the curtains, the rug textures. None of it outright cruel, just dismissive enough to sting. One afternoon, as I held fabric swatches up to the living room window, she waved her hand dismissively. "Design is charming, dear, but legacy requires vision. Tell me, your grandmother's inheritance, how was it structured?" I paused. "Structured?" "Yes, trusts, land parcels, mineral rights, that sort of thing." I stared at her. "Why would you ask that?" "I'm merely curious," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's surprising how often young wives don't understand what they actually own." I brushed it off as another odd comment, though it lodged in my mind with the persistence of a splinter. A week later, while reorganizing a storage closet, I found a faded file folder wedged behind a loose panel. My grandmother's maiden name was written across the front in her familiar looping script. Inside were several photocopied pages of a will, incomplete, edges worn, and 2 lines scribbled in my grandmother's hand. "Not safe to keep here. Do not show Reeves family." My pulse thudded. Reeves family. I sank onto the floor, the folder trembling in my hands as I reread the notes over and over. That night, when I showed it to Evan, he barely glanced at it before shrugging. "These old houses are full of random papers," he said lightly. "It probably belonged to someone else's grandmother. Don't worry about it." He reached for the folder, but instinct made me pull it closer. His eyes flickered, barely, but enough. "Fine," he said with a smile too smooth. "If it makes you feel better, keep it." I should have noticed the way he exhaled afterward, relieved. I should have realized he'd expected the file to remain hidden. After that, small things shifted. Evan locked his office door when he worked at home. Lorraine began stopping by more often, drifting through hallways and peering into drawers while pretending to admire my decor. Twice I found her in the study when she thought I wasn't home. "I was just looking for stationery," she said, though none of the drawers she searched held any. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself I was imagining what I felt, the prickle of being inspected, evaluated, measured against something invisible. But late one night, unable to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my grandmother's warning in my hands. The cottage creaked softly around me, familiar yet suddenly foreign. "Do not show Reeves family." My grandmother had hidden that file for a reason, and the more I looked at Evan, at his mother, at the house we'd barely settled into, the heavier the truth began to feel. The cottage wasn't simply our beginning, it was a place already marked by someone else's plans I was never meant to discover.